There are three preliminary remarks I'd like to make. The first is that Mitch, who's sitting over there, is as culpable as I am for what I am about to say. The second is that this is a story. It's a story about IFPRI's work in Ethiopia over a defined period starting in 1995 and ending somewhere around 2010, 2011. The third thing I want to say is to echo what Tina said this morning, that I stand here before you with a certain amount of trepidation. I'm going to talk about IFPRI and its work, and in some sense its performance. Yet in the room is the current DG, two former DGs, the former director of the division responsible for the country work that I'm going to talk about, and one or two other luminaries. So, no pressure. I want to say one or two words about why we've tried to write this paper this way. The literature on policy research is, as I'm sure most of you know, voluminous, but it doesn't deal with what we think is quite an important issue, which is the trade-off between independent research which is intellectually independent, and the influence that that research might have. The literature also stresses the need for relevance. I guess this is pretty obvious, that you need to do research which is relevant to the issues, in the policy issues in the country or the region that you're working on. But the literature does stress the need for collaboration, that you need to work with the public agencies, normally the government, otherwise engaged in research. But collaboration can, doesn't always, but it can reduce the independence of the research in certain defined circumstances. The biggest risk is what is conventionally called capture. That is to say that the consumers of the research have more than a reasonable influence over which issues are researched, maybe how the data is gathered, perhaps over analytical methods, and certainly over the way the results are treated, sometimes to the point where results are concealed. But nevertheless, capture is a matter of degree. It's rarely absolute, but it's also not often negligible. Now, I just want to say a quick word by way of background about IFPRI's approach to policy research. IFPRI was established in 1975, as most of you know, and for the next 30 years or so, its research was led primarily from Washington. There were exceptions, but mainly from Washington. But gradually, research teams were formed as IFPRI itself began to formalize its strategy and think about how it should do its work and widened its scope. Teams were formed to work on global research programs, often, I might say, with Ethiopia as a case study. These programs sought to identify IPGs, international public goods. Outreach for that work was largely supplied by purpose-built networks of policy researchers, workshops, seminars, and the other conventional means of disseminating ideas. From 1994 to 2004, this model dominated research in Ethiopia. But in 2004, things changed. They changed because IFPRI adopted a different policy, a policy that said that we want to try and work much more closely to have a more holistic effect on the policies used in a given government, in a given situation. The first attempt to do so was the ESSP, the Ethiopia Strategy Support Program. And in setting that up, introducing a number of researchers who became resident in Ethiopia, IFPRI's position changed from being outside and completely independent to being something of an insider. I think we conclude from our studies that this enhanced the relevance of IFPRI's work to Ethiopia, but at the cost of partial capture. Now, there is an argument which says that this is an inevitable cost, or might be an inevitable cost, of doing business in a country such as Ethiopia, and I'll return to that theme in a moment. We seek in this paper to compare the influence of IFPRI's work, research work, under what I've called here the ancien regime, that is the old model, the model prior to 2004, with what happened after that. For those of you who are interested, there is a much, much longer and more detailed paper available on IFPRI's website, which Mitch and I also wrote. Now, when the ESSP was introduced to Ethiopia, it was introduced into a policy climate, you might say, which was inimical to free markets. There was a Marxist-inged regime, which had been there since the revolution of 1990 or so. This ideology was favoured state intervention in many aspects of agricultural marketing, favoured cooperatives, and it essentially explains the reluctance to make the commodity exchange, a major innovation that came a bit later, the reluctance to allow that to be a private sector undertaking. It also led to the neglect of input and output markets in agriculture. IFPRI's work, allied to that of the World Bank in the mid-2000s, I guess, laid out the issues there very, very clearly and very convincingly, and yet that work was essentially ignored. The environment into which the ESSP was introduced was particular in another respect, and that is that I think it's fair to say that the Ethiopian government was unusually resistant to outside influence. It really didn't want to recognize that other people might have something to say which was useful, and it resisted pressures from the donor community for policy change in quite a strong way. So, what was the upshot for IFPRI's research? It was really that it made it very difficult for IFPRI to tackle some things head-on, to seek and apply and recommend first best solutions. And so, in a sense, second best had to become first best in a constrained environment. It also led, we think, to IFPRI adopting a rather interesting alternative way of dealing with things, two dimensions of which are particularly important. The first is that IFPRI did a lot of work which has been very successful in introducing and developing new institutions. The commodity exchange is one clear example of that, but the other is the Agricultural Transformation Agency, which came a little bit later. And you can see those institutional changes as being a way of kind of working around the constraints of first best solutions. Put very simply, it was that if you could set up a new institution with the right kind of mandate and the right kind of internal political support, you had a better chance of getting the policies adopted and maybe implemented. The second part was that there was a concentration on what we call in our paper intellectual institutions. Now, these may, in the end, have a very important role to play, but they were certainly key issues. I mean, and here I have in mind, for example, that the very good work that was done on spatial GIS analysis, spatial analysis, which painted a picture of Ethiopian agriculture and the rural economy, which had never been seen before, and allowed, or could have allowed, I don't think it's done it yet, for the kind of differentiation in policy research and policy applicability which Peter Hazel spoke about this morning, the farm size differentiation, for example. So another part of that intellectual legacy is the household survey, which was started well before the ESSP, but has gone on. It's the longest running repeated household survey in Africa. It's a source of data which is quite unique. It's, for example, spawned over 300 PhD theses, which I think is quite an impressive total. The main outputs, conventionally defined, are in the form of published and unpublished papers. Some of them peer-reviewed, some not peer-reviewed. And this is just a quick picture of what that looked like over the period concerned. The only point I want to illustrate here is that things changed over time, as you would expect, that the research agenda adjusted to different influences. Not always influences from the government, but the interests, perhaps, of the researchers themselves. The outcomes, and I'm really galloping along here, I'm probably going a bit too slowly even now. The outcomes are listed in this slide, and they are categorized according to IFPRI's breakdown of major research themes. And what I just want to emphasize here is, you can read the stuff yourself, but at the bottom is that the ESSP made some pretty key changes in the form of the CGE model, the Atlas of the Rural Economy, which I've already mentioned, and the commodity exchange, all in a pretty short space of time, if you think about the nature of that work. I'm going to dwell on this slide for just a moment. We looked very hard for direct evidence of influence. That is to say, we looked for signals or data which would tell us whether the research that IFPRI had conducted had led to clear, identifiable policy change. And we drew a blank. I mean, we have to be frank about that. Nor, of course, as a consequence of that, could we find any welfare changes. We'd had great ambitions of modeling this when we set out, but that was not to be. Now, this is partly explained by the government's ideological stance that curtailed or delayed policy actions on input markets, for example, notwithstanding the commodity exchange, and on land reform. But other factors were at work too. One was the way the research agenda itself was set. The second was how research priorities were established, and the third, how research results were disseminated. And I'm going to have something to say about each of those three very briefly. We conclude that IFPRI was partially captured. Partly, and we draw that conclusion because IFPRI failed to take a more determined stand than one might have imagined on certain controversial areas of policy, land issues, public ownership, and so on. These suggest that ESSP's research agenda was heavily influenced by the GOE's market bias. But it was also facilitated by an internal level, quite unusual level, I would suggest, of idiosyncratic priority setting. That, in other words, the research agenda was not set by a process of formal priority setting, where you might look at policy gaps, the work that might be needed to fill those gaps, and so on and so forth, but by just sheer individualistic interest and the dynamism that comes from that. And we don't underestimate that. That was a powerful ingredient in the achievements certainly related to the ECX. Oops, how do I, wrong button. I've more or less said this already. I got a bit ahead of myself. But I think it's also worth pointing out that those idiosyncratic elements, powerful and useful as they were, also played into the hands of the GOE. And we have it on good authority, I won't quote the precise source now, but that the GOE specifically used IFPRI as a way of defending itself against the predations, as it saw them, of the donor community. That, in other words, it could claim that by working with IFPRI, by collaborating with IFPRI, there was an intelligent, well-thought-through research agenda being pursued which would lead to policy change. And that was enough to keep the donor community at bay, you might say. But that idiosyncratic element has I think, left the leadership of ESSP exposed to changes, has left ESSP exposed to changes on both sides, leadership changes of its own, the management of it, and changes in the government. And of course, the Prime Minister died only a few months ago, and Ethiopia is in a state of transition. And so it's going to provide a test of this conclusion. But this partial capture, I think, worked in favor of the ESSP. It allowed it to pursue its agenda of institutional change, which I mentioned earlier, and the openness agenda. Many of the interlocutors with whom we interacted, I'm almost there, have made the point to us that one of the probable lasting benefits of IFPRI's presence is the fact that there has been a slow but steady increase in the willingness of the government to engage in evidence-based discussion and evidence-based policy change. Now, the evidence of the change is not really there, but I think the fact that so many people feel that the quality of policy discussion is rising and that IFPRI has significantly contributed to that is at least a harbinger of likely good fortune. One lacuna which we do observe is that IFPRI has made, I would say, inadequate attempts to push its findings. Advocacy is widely written up in the literature as a key ingredient of successful policy change based upon research. But it requires a fairly strategic approach. You need to figure out what you're going to advocate, who you're going to try and target, who you're going to persuade, how are you going to do that, apply some resources to the problem, and so on. And we found little evidence that IFPRI had been doing that. So, what does it all amount to? We conclude that Ethiopia's policy research, that IFPRI's policy research in Ethiopia, both before and after the ESSP, was relevant, but it didn't, or it has not yet, had much influence on policy change. The idiosyncratic dimension was instrumental in facilitating access, but also a two-way street. It allowed for an increase in the degree of capture. And that capture strengthened GOE's resistance to reform, reduced the prevalence of first best solutions, and delayed others over what might have been. I'm leaving you with a question. It's in red on that slide. Could these risks have been foreseen? I'd like to let you think about that. Thank you very much.